It's great to see you all in person. I'm Malo Hudson, the new dean of the UVA School of Architecture. So I want to welcome all of you who are here in person, and for all of you online who are watching wherever you are around the world. You are in for a delight today as we have our guest speaker, Mia Bay from the University of Pennsylvania. This is the Plavnick Lecture in Urban Environmental Planning. We are very delighted to have that and are thankful for the support for our various endowed lecture series. And we know it'll add to our intellectual environment here, as well as engaging our alums, friends of the university, and so forth. So we very much thank you for taking the time out to watch online and to be here in person. So with that said, I want to also introduce someone who's just absolutely been a wonderful colleague to me already since I've just arrived, and is the new chair of Urban Environmental Planning, Suzanne Mumma. She needs no introduction. She is just absolutely fantastic, and she'll provide the warm welcome and introduction to Professor Mia Bay. So, Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And a special welcome to our new dean. Oops. Well, I'm going to put a prop up first. Okay. Well, welcome to all of you to the Plavnick Lecture. This lecture is particularly important because it's our first time to convene in person in about 500 days. So this is a monumental day in the life of the architecture school. But let me tell you a little bit about Mia Bay. But I want to start with a little story. Mark Twain always said it always embarrassed him when people complimented him because he never felt like they'd said quite enough. So in the case of Mia Bay, you couldn't say quite enough. So I'm going to take a very long CV and boil it down to some critical points. So we are so fortunate to have Mia Bay with us today. Her extraordinary body of work spans race and retail, intellectual history of Black women, writings of anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells, and the image of whites by Blacks from the pre-Civil War to post-Jim Crow. Fascinating book in itself. In addition, she's published in journals and edited volumes a mile long, shall we say. So she is well known in this field. But tonight and today, we are asking her to talk about her new book, Traveling Black. The story, Traveling Back, a story of race and resistance. This should be read by every one of us, but every American, to understand how we got to this point and what people endured to get here. A little bit about her background. Professor Bay did her undergraduate work at the University of Toronto and her Ph.D. in history at Yale. She's been awarded many fellowships, including the national fellowships at the National Humanities Center, the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, which she can tell you about that visit if she likes, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard, and the American Council of Learned Societies, to name only a few. But here's what I want you to know, and in my short opportunity to get to know her better about her work. She's a scholar's scholar. Her work is thorough, it's beautifully written, and it pushes the intellectual boundaries and social mores that need to be pushed. It is my pleasure and our honor to welcome Mia Bay to the University of Virginia, but also to the School of Architecture. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for these great introductions. I very much appreciate being here. I feel a little bit of an imposter as the Plavnick lecturer because I'm not an urban planner, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm someone who just kind of stumbled onto these questions about travel. My training is in intellectual history, but of course, people exist in the world, and some of my people were actually inspired towards activism by not being able to ride on a train. So it gets you there. So that's something I sort of said about exploring on a project that was initially just sort of curiosity. I didn't even know it was going to lead to a book, but like, how did this kind of segregation take shape? And why was it something that so many African Americans talked about, protested, and found generally infuriating? So today I just want to give you an overview of Traveling Black, which explores the intertwined history of travel segregation and Black struggles for freedom of movement, both of which are really central themes in our history. It follows the experiences of generations of African Americans as they traveled on various forms of transportation, and it kind of looks at these forms of transportation from stagecoaches to steamship to railways to cars to buses and planes successively. And in looking at this and kind of looking at segregation and how it emerged, I also came across a sort of sustained fight for mobility among African Americans that had really previously been neglected or not kind of connected properly. So what the book does is it does connect it, and it reconstructs the history of a moving color line that was shaped not only by the regional racial politics that gave rise to the South's Jim Crow laws, but also by technological advances that moved Americans out of stagecoaches and steamships and into planes, trains, automobiles, and buses. We don't often think about the passenger transportation revolution and the way it reshaped our world, but what it did, among other things, was racialize new kinds of mobile space, creating a form of segregation that could be regional in character, but was never wholly limited to the South. The planes, trains, and buses that people traveled on crisscrossed the Mason-Dixon line. And as they did so, they also changed the ways in which all Americans travel in ways that made race, class, and gender of travelers more important. So I'm going to show a lot of images, and if I seem like I'm rushing through them, we can come back to them. But you really have to kind of think about these things in real life, I found. So we start with things like stage travel, which is where these are the earliest forms of common carriers. This is when you begin to have people who are not walking, people who can afford these things. And segregation takes shape alongside the development of these kind of common carriers. Black passengers were often relegated to riding on top of stagecoaches, on the decks of steamships. These kind of accommodations were usually half price. They were where working class whites who were lucky enough to be able to afford any form of transportation would ride, along with servants and slaves. Segregation on the railroad comes after this, so it comes out of a system that's already sort of emerged. And in the railroad, it actually becomes part of how railroads work. Early railroads have only a couple of cars, and the first car behind the engine, which is also known sometimes as the refuse car, is a sparsely furnished car where there's sometimes garbage, sometimes equipment. They're also often half price, and African Americans are required to ride in them. And this is in the North where passenger railroads first become common, and this kind of segregation is enforced by carriers rather than laws, and it's shaped by anxieties over the abolition of slavery, which is taking place in the 1830s, like it's coming, 1820s, 30s, as these early trains are first beginning to run. It creates white anxieties about Black freedom. It also creates a class of Blacks affluent enough to be able to afford to use stagecoaches and railroads. And the result is this sort of hostility towards them, including sometimes from the people who operated the trains and operated, before that, the stagecoaches and steamships. So you have from early on, blacks being expelled from various forms of transportation. You also have African Americans fiercely resisting this, sometimes to the point of knockdown, drag-out fights on railroads, stagecoaches. Frederick Douglass, for instance, once was so determined not to leave a railroad car that he actually took the chair that was attached to the floor with him, because he was a very strong guy. 4 or 5 people carried him out with the furniture. And this kind of fight had to do with politics as well as just wanting a comfortable seat. Men such as Frederick Douglass and women as well felt that the eradication of color prejudice was crucial to the anti-slavery struggle, so they really didn't want to live in a world in which they were being obviously marked as inferior. And for this reason, they made a political priority and successfully fought off railroad segregation in areas such as Massachusetts, where they had supporters. And it became less common in the North by the Civil War and even less after that. But at the same time, segregation would proliferate in the 19th century South as the end of Reconstruction would bring the reconstruction of white supremacy and a wave of Jim Crow laws that actually starts with what were called separate car laws. Separate car laws being laws that required blacks to ride in a separate car. We hear a lot about Plessy versus Ferguson, but people sometimes forget that it was a railroad case, and it was a case in which the Supreme Court upheld the separate car laws. And all this kind of demonstrates how central transportation is to the evolution of segregation. So you begin to get, with separate car laws, this sort of distinctive travel world in which African Americans operate. The late 19th century for most Americans was what is still known as the golden age of the railroads, where you saw kind of ads like this for very luxurious travel all the time. Railroads handled 98% of inner city transportation, as well as more than 75% of freight. They traversed millions of miles. There were 85,000 stations. They were unavoidable. But all the kind of enjoyable features of the golden age of travel completely bypass African Americans, who are rarely permitted to occupy these kinds of spaces. I think I'm a little out of order, or no, I'm missing it. But what I would say, from this is that African Americans work in these spaces. You typically have black men, sometimes black women, working on the trains, but they're often blocked from occupying these kinds of spaces. With the passage of the separate car laws in the South, the barriers are legal, and in the North, it's still quite customary for blacks to be barred from more high-end accommodations, which often have a surcharge, and they really are, the conductors discourage African American passengers from buying these tickets. So in the South, railroad transportation actually gets worse as in the golden age of the railroads. With the passage of Plessy versus Ferguson, it becomes clear the courts are going to do nothing to actually police separate but equal. So you have, for white passengers, trains improving. As Jim Crow cars get worse, they literally rotate the old cars into the Jim Crow section. So people are riding in cars that have wooden benches while the white cars are upholstered. The distinction is always visible and obvious, and it grows increasingly uncomfortable over time. And this is a time when there really is no other game in town when it comes to transportation. One of the things I sort of came across in writing this book is the idea that blacks don't really travel that much. Just a lot of people who write about tourism are like, well, blacks don't really go anywhere during this time period. But of course, there's the Great Migration, which takes place on the railroad lines. This is a map of it. So everyone is sort of forced to ride the train. It's not only people migrating, which they often do by train, but a lot of black leaders move in and out of the South. This is a region when African Americans really become a national population with a national leadership. And everyone, regardless of their status, ends up having to ride the train, sort of get back and forth to go to meetings, to keep up with their family. So the Jim Crow car becomes the sort of central feature of Black life, and it's something that goes across class lines. African Americans who are affluent and well-to-do know what it is like to travel Jim Crow, as do ordinary people. So here's one example of a Jim Crow car that sort of speaks to what they were like. It's a center door combination car. On routes where there weren't that many Black passengers, the Jim Crow car often had other things in it. Most commonly, the smoking area for men was in the Jim Crow car. And given that the partitions were not very big, this often meant that the Jim Crow car was effectively the smoking car, as a lot of African Americans commented at the time. They could also contain the luggage area. They could also be where livestock was carried, where prisoners were transported. So anything kind of went in the Jim Crow car. And this was something that was very much resented by African Americans who rode in them. So what I was going to, so you see these partitions, and these are older cars. And what begins to happen by the turn of the century is that the railroads are beginning to move towards all metal passenger cars, but they move the old wooden cars into the Jim Crow section. And what you begin to have is this phenomenon of Jim Crow car wrecks, where what will happen is there will be a train crash, which are very common over the turn of the century, and the Jim Crow car will be crushed between the metal locomotive and the new all-metal passenger cars. And you'll have these train cars in which all of the casualties, or virtually all of the casualties, are people sitting in the Jim Crow car. This is doubly ironic because, again, this is a time when there's all these improvements in railroad transportation. Railroads across the country have begun to replace oil lamps and coal stoves. They've installed electric lights, steam heating systems, all in these new metal cars. And they're actually advertising things like no more passengers burned alive, to emphasize the safety of these new cars. But African Americans are riding in these Jim Crow cars, which are in fact unsafe. And this goes largely unnoticed. There is some talk at a federal level of passing some sort of law to require the railroads to use only metal cars, but this never happens. There continue to be Jim Crow car crashes until 1951. So here are some famous ones. The Great Train Wreck of 1918, which involved something like almost 100 people died. There's also the Hamlet that I saw you earlier. This was an excursion train wreck in which you had a whole bunch of people who were just going on a sort of picnic excursion who had chartered a special car, all sort of killed and injured in this car. So these are the kind, and these are things that Black newspapers were aware of. Nobody's really written about the Jim Crow car wrecks, and when I was researching this, I kept coming across all these references in Black newspapers to how many Black people versus white people died in train crashes. And I thought, this is the strangest little tally people are keeping. And it took me like years to realize that the reason they were keeping count is that there's with this ongoing systemic problem that meant that it was actually relatively rare that white people died in train crashes. And many Black people do. So these are among the many surprises I came across researching this book. But with these kind of dangers, you also have just a lot of sort of everyday, workaday humiliations that are things that Black travelers can't escape. By the beginning of the 1890s, they had not just separate car laws, but a lot of southern states began to pass laws requiring railroad stations to be segregated in various ways, waiting rooms, bathrooms. And where these laws weren't passed, this also became the norm. So this is slowly kind of installed in various railroads, retrofitted in some case. And African Americans at the time actually see it sort of coming in real time. In 1891, the Black academic William Scarborough described one of the South's new and most unpleasant innovations as the novelty of 3 waiting rooms, one for ladies, one for gentlemen, and one for neither ladies or gentlemen, but for Negroes. That Negroes were neither ladies or gentlemen, he said, was a point that could be inferred from the conditions in the latter. And this was true. They were, as was typical of segregated facilities, generally the facilities for Blacks were usually notably decrepit, less impressive. And there were also things around access in all the colored waiting rooms that were really kind of striking. The new palatial buildings, such as Atlanta's new railroad, would have these grand waiting rooms, several ladies' waiting rooms, and then a sort of tiny little waiting room for Blacks. And it had to be entered from the side of the building. And that was fairly characteristic of Southern Railroad stations, that the Black entrance would be in a different spot and often quite inconvenient. And these kind of decisions, the size, location, and even sort of unkempt status of colored waiting rooms in Atlanta's terminal and other places, were the result of very deliberate decisions made by the railroads that maintained these facilities. Even the dirt in the colored waiting room was designed to underscore the racial hierarchies inscribed in it. In one exchange I read about, a Black porter was asked why the colored waiting room was so filthy, and he explained that he was expected not to keep the Negro waiting room as clean as the one for whites. The differential had to be maintained. And this also meant that Blacks who passed through the station waiting room, the only Blacks who could sort of pass through the main areas would be red caps, servants, and porters. So all of this sort of underscored that the main waiting room put Blacks sort of out of the picture. This was also emphasized by the sort of basic design in smaller waiting rooms, which generally had a shared ticket office. You can see it on the blueprint here, the general waiting room, the colored waiting room, and Blacks and whites would have to get their tickets from basically the same person through different windows. And by custom in the South, that meant that Blacks always had to be served after whites. So one of the weird and kind of unpredictable challenges of traveling by rail as a Black person was whether you'd be able to buy your ticket before the train left. It would depend on how many white people were ahead of you. Sometimes when African Americans arrived at the train station, they found themselves forced to purchase their tickets moments after the train pulled out of the station. Food was an even bigger problem on the railroads. African Americans were largely barred from the dining car for many years, and when they were admitted, it was a long, complex negotiation that had African Americans eating after whites, eating behind curtains. So that was a perennial struggle and gave rise to some Black traditions that a lot of people may be familiar with, carrying big boxes of food on the train, preparation for everything you need. All of this basically meant that African Americans were thrilled to have alternatives to the train. And you'd see this throughout this era, that new forms of transportation would be welcomed by Blacks. Du Bois, for example, W.B. Du Bois, who maintained that there was not in the world a more disgraceful denial of human brotherhood than the Jim Crow car of the Southern United States, started buying cars as soon as they became available. This picture of his first car is undated, but his papers include a 1918 receipt for a driver's license. So he obviously started very early. In 1918, they barely had roads to drive cars on, but he was ready. And likewise, you have other well-known African Americans moving very quickly into cars. World heavyweight champion Jack Johnson loved to drive. He owned several cars, and he was obviously a man far too proud and uncomfortable to enjoy traveling Jim Crow. He drove everywhere. And it was controversial because at this point it was still controversial for African Americans to own and operate cars. There were questions about whether blacks had mechanical ability. This is the early years of the 20th century. There was a certain kind of envy, and Jack Johnson, when he drove, attracted some mixture of admiration and jealousy among policemen. He received tickets for speeding, reckless driving, obstructing traffic, and other moving violations wherever he went, which did not discourage him from driving. He actually parked his cars on the sidewalk in Chicago, and he told people that his constant speeding was a form of advertising. So he was not discouraged. And he was not the only one that was not discouraged. Working class Americans started to buy cars relatively early. I found more evidence on this than I expected. People bought a lot of used cars. Sometimes they didn't own them for a long time. Sometimes they didn't work well, but there was clearly this sort of desire to have the freedoms involved in owning a car. And you also get, with the development of cars, the development of what becomes ultimately buses, but they start out as cars like everything else. They're called jitneys. There was a jitney revolution around World War I where people were riding jitneys in cities. Usually the jitneys competed directly with streetcars, and they appealed to a variety of people for a variety of reasons. They were only a nickel. The streetcar systems were overcrowded. But for African Americans, they were also an escape from the segregation on the streetcars, which had been legislated across the South in the first decade of the 20th century. African Americans formed their own Jim Crow jitneys. They drew on their knowledge of automotive technology to create these small businesses. And there was a real sense for at least a while that the Jim Crow jitney, as black-only bus companies were called, and they weren't black-only. You could ride, blacks sometimes couldn't ride in white jitneys, but whites could usually ride in black jitneys. Jim Crow never was completely even in that way. But there was some sense that now blacks would have their own transportation systems, and there were, in fact, a number of small black inner-city bus lines operated by Negroes for Negroes, but they were never particularly numerous, and they began to disappear altogether when travel dropped precipitously in the Great Depression. And even the sort of urban jitneys, they disappear pretty quickly. They're regulated out of existence. There were issues about insurance, around municipal commitments to streetcars that made them very short-lived. But what they do is set up a context, a sort of history in which blacks are initially barred from regular inner-city buses as they evolve out of the jitney system. The earliest buses that start in places like Minnesota start out as kind of a white jitney. They take minors and they don't carry African Americans. So you see sort of early commentary on this among blacks that often what happens is if they want to take a bus, the bus just kind of sails on by them. It underscores the ways in which both cars and the sort of entire system of automobility, of movement by gas-powered vehicles, becomes kind of inaccessible to African Americans in the beginning. It's deeply racialized in a variety of different ways. Blacks are not picked up by many early bus companies, and then they begin to face various forms of exclusion, both inside and out of the South. An expose published in the Chicago Defender in 1927 revealed that some bus lines refused to carry black passengers, others would carry only a limited number, and all but one of the intercity bus lines then serving Chicago seated Black passengers in the back of the bus. This is another instance in which segregation really extends to the north. This series was researched by a white journalist who posed as a Southerner who didn't want to sit next to a person of color, and he was assured by one company that they only sat Black people in the back. Another one assured him that they never sold tickets to Negroes. They might sell some tickets to Mexicans, but even Mexicans would have to sit in the rear, and they did not plan to have Blacks. Generally, these kinds of informal segregation would involve things like, as the journalist was told, Black travelers were simply told that there were no tickets available. The reasons why the bus companies are unwilling to carry Black travelers are obviously include racism, but they also speak to a sort of racism that runs throughout the whole system. One of the reasons why bus companies are reluctant to take on Black passengers is that Black customers are often unwelcome at the roadside rest stops that are crucial to long-distance travel by bus. Bus companies and other common carriers are required under common law to sell tickets to anyone who wishes to buy one. That's part of the definition of common carriers. But the gas stations and rest stops were not, and some of them would not admit Blacks, which meant that some early Black bus travelers would have to stay on the bus when at the rest stops, at the restaurants. Sometimes they were warned that it was an 11-hour trip and there would be no place where they could get off and go to the bathroom or get a meal. And this is obviously an equally important problem for Black car drivers. The sort of early freedoms that people like Jack Johnson and W.B. Du Bois looked for became problematic as the road system expands and African American drivers face ubiquitous challenges when it comes to consumption. Traveling any distance by car requires stops for food, gas, and accommodations. And for Black travelers, it took them outside their own community, where they often might have to navigate segregation, but they would know where they could go. And it took them into terrain where they had no idea what kind of discrimination could be in place. African Americans were often not allowed to use any facilities at Southern gas stations, which really puzzled me for a while. I mean, they didn't want, the owners of some of these stations didn't want Black people to buy gas or oil. And that got me kind of thinking about the history of the gas station and retail racism. And I sort of pieced together that these slides really had an economic rationale. Black consumers were not the primary target of the service station industry. It was developed to encourage women to drive. Gas was initially sold mainly at hardware stores, feedlots, places men went. But service stations were really developed to make driving easy for women and comfortable for women. And they're actually targeted women. That many of them have this sort of cottage design, which you still see today. Much of their advertising was directed to women. The idea was if you're selling largely indistinguishable products such as motor oil and gasoline, you want to create a welcoming, home-like environment that will ensure consumer loyalty at a time when most customers are white. And among the drivers you really want to encourage is a new generation of female drivers. You can see it in the advertising. There was something called the White Patrol that Texaco did many years, which actually seems to have been a white patrol. And there's emphasis on the bathrooms, the cleanliness. There's articles about how you should dress up your station with flowers. It's all designed to target white women. And for that reason, Blacks are sometimes entirely unwelcome. And this is just among many other kind of barriers that African American drivers encounter. Driving itself is complicated by race. In Southern towns, sometimes Jim Crow etiquette even extended to the rules of the road. In the early days of driving at four-way intersections in the South, the right-of-way was sometimes initially determined not by who reached the intersection first, but by the race of the driver, because it was a society in which blacks were supposed to be deferential to whites, especially when the white driver was also female. But this was not a system that actually worked very well because black drivers would have white drivers behind them. It made no sense. It proved dangerous, and there was a move towards normal driving rules over time. But African American drivers and unfamiliar territory still had to be careful. They sometimes pulled aside for white drivers as a precautionary measure. When the interstates developed, they would stay on interstates. And they had many reasons to avoid these kind of issues, and one of which was that insurance was not available to African American drivers for many years. During the early years of automotive insurance, you had things such as this auto club that explicitly said that blacks could not get insurance. Other places you had insurers who explained that it was simply not economically feasible to offer insurance to black people because if they got into a collision in the South, it would be customarily their fault, and this would be expensive. And this seemed to be fairly true in the North. African Americans only became kind of universally able to receive auto insurance with the advent of state laws that made it mandatory that, if nothing else, the state created risk pools that could get everyone insurance. But this was a widespread problem. Thurgood Marshall once got turned down for auto insurance because he lived in a congested neighborhood, Harlem. And there was nothing he could do about it. He wrote around in his papers, people are saying, hey, you do live in a congested neighborhood, so you can't do anything. So these are some of the challenges black drivers faced. Other things that really surprised me were things like segregated parking, which was something I didn't really expect to find, but actually was not uncommon. There were some towns in which blacks couldn't park at all on Saturdays. That was the white shopping day. There were a lot of workplaces in which blacks parked in different spots. And other things like this, just kind of random, where you see colored parking. And it underscores the way in which parking, like so many other things, is a hierarchical activity. Starting in the 1930s, buses become routinely segregated. They're subject to the same segregation laws or similar segregation laws as trains. And bus stations and rest stops are designed along segregated lines. So you have a landscape that reflects this segregation. It becomes increasingly ubiquitous. It underscores the separation going to the bathroom, the different kind of rest stops. And this is the landscape of several generations of African Americans. And it imposes really particular difficulties on black travelers that many people who have been alive long enough can remember, and that people generally understood to be really onerous. Driving, on the one hand, gave black drivers more flexibility than bus passengers and train passengers, but accommodations were far and few in between sometimes. As late as 1960, reasonable sleeping accommodations for black travelers were an average of 141 miles apart between Washington and Miami, and a whopping 174 miles apart between Washington and New Orleans. Moreover, a lot of the establishments that admitted black travelers, like these cabins for colors, were small and therefore could not be counted to have vacant rooms. They often were sort of under capitalized. They were often not that pleasant. And it meant that traveling black was not just humiliating, but could be dangerous when people were forced to drive many miles before they could find a place to sleep. They were loaded up their cars with food, water, maps, all these things, so they didn't have to stop and ask for directions. They didn't have to stop and get food. People also sometimes carried toilet paper and pecans on the assumption that they would not be able to use roadside accommodations, and some people even carried gas for fear that they would not be able to buy gas. This also prompts the advent of all these sort of different guides. Lately, we've been hearing about the Green Book due to the movie on the same theme. But one thing I find striking is the Green Book is not the first. There's many different guides. Many of them kind of struggle for a market, an audience, for certain reasons, for distribution, but they start as early as 1929. This Hackley and Harrison's Hotel Apartment Guide is a very early one, and they come out of this problem of finding accommodations, especially in a world in which the accommodations that African Americans could stay in often included like an individual room in a private home as opposed to an actual hotel, especially in places like New England. So people who use things like Hackley and Harrison would include someone like W.B. Du Bois, who, when he was traveling to New England on business, had to write a whole bunch of letters just to try to find a place to stay in New London. And eventually stumbled on Sarah Harrison, one of the co-authors of this book, who had a room in her cottage that she rented out. This particular guide would be short-lived. It appeared just as the Great Depression disseminated travel. But subsequent guides would prove more enduring. And here we get to things like the Green Book. These are a sampling of the guides published between the 1930s and 1960s. There are actually many more. Most well-known and most widely distributed is the Negro Traveler's Green Book, which started in 1936. And it was republished annually for 30 years and is reportedly reached a circulation high of 2 million in 1962. It was founded by Victor Green, who was a mailman who lived in Harlem and worked in New Jersey, and had close connections with people in the music industry, and traveling musicians were among the people who found a lot of these travel restrictions particularly difficult. Even before these guides, they kept lists, and the Green Book partially is based on these kind of lists. It's also based on some other kinds of guides, like the New York City's Organized Cashew Laboratories Kosher Food Guide, which told observant Jewish women where they could eat, as well as where hotels that welcomed Jewish travelers. So it tries to help people navigate this. And by the time you get to the 50s, you have guidebooks like Travel Guide that promises vacation and recreation without humiliation. And this sort of underscores that people want to know where they can go. But the guidebooks never entirely address this question. There's many different dangers that African Americans face on the road. African Americans who drive nice cars are often subject to police scrutiny and harassment, as is sort of true today as well. And they encounter white hostility. And the guides are not 100% reliable. These places change. There's always a kind of uncertainty about whether the small sort of roadside place being advertised is still going to be in business, or which one is good. So African American travelers would complain that the guides weren't really a sort of real solution to anything, and continue to look for other kinds of solutions. So you also get, with flying, once again, African Americans being very excited about a new form of transportation that they feel could be some sort of escape. One World War II Air Force pilot William Ellis, one of the early black flyers, hoped that air travel would simply squeeze out Jim Crow. He felt that there was not enough room in the back of airplanes. People will simply have to travel closer together. He also hoped that he and other black flyers who served during the war would be hired to pilot planes, or they might even actually establish their own airlines. But this was difficult from the beginning. It's especially evident when you look at the history of aviation that many people thought technology was really the exclusive preserve of white people. Charles Lindbergh, the famous flyer, who actually was also sort of famous for his racism, and he claimed that black people could not fly. You have in the sort of cartoon a kind of idea that black people flying is ridiculous. And in fact, there is scattered evidence that some of the early airlines did refuse to carry black passengers, much like buses. There were eventually court cases that established that airlines were common carriers, just like buses, and they did have to carry everyone. But by the 1940s, you begin to have a system of segregated seating, which was one of the surprising discoveries of my research. Nobody's really written about it, but there's a lot of scattered evidence to suggest that there was a phase in which African American passengers were typically asked to sit in the front seat of the airplane. There were usually not a lot of black travelers, and it took me a while to figure out why the front seat. But at that time, there were the planes had propellers in the front, and the front seat was right by the propeller. There were a lot of sparks. Nobody wanted to sit in it. So for a while, that's where African American travelers would be seated. And once the plane designs changed, that would ultimately change by the 1950s. Airlines seem to have adopted the less obvious system of segregating black passengers by confining them to their own row on a plane, which is actually something my mother experienced on her first airplane. She was like, why are there two black people on the plane and we're both in the same row? But it's not a coincidence. What they would do is move black people if needed, and several airlines also reportedly trained their phone operators to identify African Americans either by their voice or their zip codes and assign them only to specific flights. This all came to light in the 1950s when there was actually a lawsuit against American Airlines by an employee who refused to do this, and there was a court order encouraging airlines to cease and desist. I do not know whether they actually did. But traveling by plane did end up being the least segregated form of transportation in the air. Traveling by plane is generally interstate. Legally, it's very difficult to segregate interstate transportation. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision didn't actually apply to interstate commerce. But on the ground, there was also segregation in the airports. Here you see a colored waiting room in Montgomery, Alabama. This was pretty common, colored waiting rooms, black and white restrooms. And this is something that was taking shape even as other forms of segregation were beginning to fall apart or sort of be beaten back in the courts. Charles C. Diggs, an early black congressman, was initially heartened to travel by plane and feel like old patterns of segregation and discrimination were falling away, but then he discovered that they were sort of being added over time. He wrote a 1955 letter to the president of Continental Airlines saying that now he had begun to routinely encounter waiting rooms marked for whites only, as well as separate water fountains, taxi and limousine drivers who would not carry people. And this would all continue through the 1960s when the Kennedy administration finally launched a series of cases against airports designed to put an end to this practice. You also had protesters such as these freedom flyers who were inspired by the freedom rides of the 1960s to protest segregation in airports. And all of this is part of how this all falls apart, are these sustained protests. And these protests generally come after the laws have changed, but segregation is very sticky, so it requires not just the outlawing of segregation, but also all these public protests actually putting the question to the world. So this is part of the story of the book, and I think I just want to sort of end by talking briefly about the ways in which the successes of the civil rights movement, which actually proved remarkably successful in getting rid of these sort of colored-only areas and signs, they prove in certain ways a kind of Pyrrhic victory because they come at a time when all forms of travel by bus and train are beginning to decline. There's a triumph of car culture that reshapes both long-distance transportation and local transportation. It decimates service on all forms of mass transportation. So now we no longer have Jim Crow cars, but we no longer have very many trains. We no longer have Jim Crow buses, but many areas are not served by bus transportation. And we have these ongoing mobility issues that we see are very much highlighted in moments like Hurricane Katrina, any kind of disaster. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, there was literally no plan for what people who didn't own cars would do to get out of town. So you still have these inequalities of mobility, and you still have also the dangers of segregated transportation, which obviously extend beyond the dangers of disasters, though those are considerable, towards racial profiling, which has actually become worse over time with the drug war of the 1980s and beyond. The racial profiling on the highway has become part of the Black driving experience to a greater extent than it ever was. There has always been an experience of driving while Black, but that phrase is actually coined during the Reagan era and is something that we see running through today's Black Lives Matter movement, all of which underscores how these transportation battles are still ongoing. I think I'm going to stop there and take questions. Once again, I want to thank you for inviting me and thank you for attending.